Good evening and welcome to Slam the Gavel, the show that tells it all regarding family court, other court issues, as well as CPS. I am your host, Marianne Petrie. This episode of Slam the Gavel is sponsored by CPS Protect Consulting Services. A child protective services case is one of the most frightening experiences for any parent. Don't face it alone. Face it with confidence with Urgent Assist by CPS Protect. You can have access to former CPS investigators to make sure you preserve your rights and protect your family. If you're facing CPS involvement and aren't sure where to turn, their child welfare consultants can help you. Visit cpsprotect.com/subscribe and enter the coupon code SLAMTHEGAVEL for 10% off your first year of Urgent Assist. And this is available in all 50 states. I have another announcement. Bradley's mother, Narcus Golan, passed away 4 months ago. Bradley is autistic and needs structured routine and therapies he receives for his autism 6 days a week. However, Italy just entrusted Bradley to the Italian Social Services. If he is ruled to go back to Italy, he will then face the only years he will have in the Italian foster care system, approximately 3 to 4 years, and he can't speak or understand the language. He will then be taken away from the only family he has ever known. Please call Governor Hochul's office at 518-474-8390. That's Governor Hochul, 518-474-8390 to please keep Bradley here safe in these United States. Hashtag keep Bradley safe. I have a brand new guest on. I have Mr. Chris Marino on. He's a resident of Los Angeles, California, Calabasas, California. He is a U.S. Navy veteran, a graduate of the University of San Diego. He's 51 years old and a father to 5 daughters and a survivor of being a targeted parent and enduring parental alienation, a legitimate child abuse phenomenon. He was excommunicated from the lives of his daughters for 4 years, and in the course of his parental alienation journey, he had experienced 3 different attorneys and ultimately became his own attorney, and acting as such, managed to convince a trial court of the existence of parental alienation and secure the custody of his daughters before it was too late. I welcome you, Chris Marino, to Slam the Gavel. I'm very grateful to have you on to explain your case. And how'd you do it? How'd you make it through?
Marianne, thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for the intro. I really appreciate that.
Well, as we were talking earlier, we were in the middle of this podcast and we had gotten cut off due to a power failure. So we're back here redoing this.
Yeah. The redo.
Thank you for your patience.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I guess probably where we should start again is what parental alienation is, because lately parental alienation has been a rubber stamp for so many things that aren't truly parental alienation. In fact, we can talk about a lot of the negative press that the phenomena of parental alienation gets. Lately, it's been referred to as pseudoscience and junk psychology and some other stuff, which really takes away from the reality and the horror that so many parents are suffering when they're targeted. But what parental alienation is, in a nutshell, it is in the absence of sexual abuse, physical abuse, alcoholism, drug use, and some other things you normally associate with the dysfunction in a child-parent relationship. What PA is a situation where a parent who had a once loving and strong bond with the child suddenly has a relationship that is de-evolved to the point where that child wants nothing to do with that parent, hates the parent, never wants to see the parent, associates everything with that parent and everything about that parent as bad. That can include grandparents, friends, relatives. PA is the absence of an explanation where a child goes through a metamorphosis and for no apparent reason suddenly hates another parent. Now, in my particular case, I want to put it out there. There weren't allegations of sexual abuse, physical abuse, drug use, alcoholism. My case is public record for anybody to see. It's out there in the public domain. Nothing like that existed, and I had a very strong bond I had an amazing bond with my three children, who at the time that my ex-wife and I divorced, this was back in 2017, so they were 11, 10, and 9. Um, and at that time, we had an amazing relationship, my daughters and I, a loving relationship, a physically affectionate relationship. And then over the course of about 6 months, as the divorce began and progressed, my children went through an evolution. And I know many parents will recognize this. What started loving degraded, and I think it first manifested in the children saying, "Hey, I don't want to, can I stay home this weekend with mom because so and so, I want to see a friend, whatever." And going through that experience as a parent, you want to make allowances for the child, so you say yes. That becomes repetition, and then you kind of put your, you kind of put the brakes on. You say, "No, this is dad's weekend, we're going to see you this weekend, this is dad's visitation time." And then so immediately the children begin to show resistance to seeing me because I didn't let them go with their friends. And then that evolved to them not wanting to hug me, them not wanting to, I would tell them I love them and I would get nothing back.
Mm.
I remember this was 2017, about 2 months before Christmas. I remember one of my daughters saying, "Hey, is it okay if we spend Christmas with mom?"
Mm.
Of course, what can I say to that? I I don't, I didn't want to say no because that makes me the bad guy. So of course, I remember saying, your mom and I will discuss that, and that was met with resistance. Like, just tell mom you don't want to see us, and then we won't have to see you. And then it just, everything continues to just go downhill gradually. Then it gets to a point where the children are no longer respectful to you, don't want to listen to you. Um, in the case of my children evolved to a place where uh, they wouldn't communicate at all. Like, we got to the point where there were visitations, and I'll talk about those, where I camped out on the steps of Starbucks for 8 hours while my child was inside, and I sat on the steps outside because they wouldn't spend any visitation time with me, and they were just going to hold fort in Starbucks until mom came back to pick them up. But between that, there's a lot that occurs, and there's a lot of interference that goes on. Um, and when you and then a lot of people who will be listening to this will think, no, you're leaving out some details. What else is there? There must be some reason why a child goes from one end of the spectrum to the other. And that's what PA is. It's in the absence of an explanation to the contrary. You have an evolution of a child that goes from loving to hateful.
Mm-hmm.
So we were in the family court system in Los Angeles, and to give you some background on what that's like, our case was filed in 2017, the Stanley Moss Courthouse in Los Angeles, and we were appointed a judge. Of course, I did my background. Who is this judge? I wanted to know everything about him. And this is going to be indicative of much of the problem in the family court system. The judge that was appointed to us had come from a background of corporate law, patent infringement, proprietary interest, litigation. So that was his background when he was appointed by the governor. So now he's appointed as a judge, and he's been put on the family law bench. And so far as I know, because nobody's been able to explain it to me, there is no training to be a family law judge. Of course, you're familiar with the Code of Civil Procedure in the state, and you understand things as an attorney, and you understand what authority you have as a judge, which in many cases is judge, jury, and executioner, and you go to work.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the case of my judge or any judge put in that situation, I actually have some sympathy for them in hindsight, because I think, well, if I'm that judge and I'm doing proprietary and corporate interest law one day,
Mm-hmm.
and then family law the next day, it's analogous, Marianne, to taking an ice cube and throwing it into a spinning blender
Mm-hmm.
and hoping that the ice cube will be okay. Because that's the family law system.
Mm-hmm.
It's depraved like you can't even believe. It's filled with horror and treachery, the likes of which many people won't ever even understand or learn. Everything that you could think of: abuse, drug use, the estrangement, deadbeat parents who just disavow their children, prostitution, just all. I mean, if you can think of a depravity in the family law system, Los Angeles is where you can go to the Stanley Moss Courthouse in any day and see it firsthand. So we're now on the docket with thousands and literally thousands of other cases that are in the process of divorce, and we're put in front of a judge who previously has no family law experience, and suddenly he has us. He has the case of Chris Marino versus his ex-wife, or in the case of his ex-wife versus Chris Marino, as it were. My ex-wife was the petitioner, and I was the defendant. Um,
Mm.
and when we first got before him, my children hadn't de-evolved yet, and I had attorneys at that time. I had attorneys initially, and I think this is a good point to digress. I ended up going through 3 attorneys. I'm in debt to this very day. I'm in debt to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars that I'll probably be paying back for probably the next 10 years. The first attorneys that I had, I can remember my naivete. And I think this is an important point to talk about, because so many people make the mistake of thinking, I've given my attorney a retainer.
Mm-hmm.
That's the divorce. The divorce is now over. Well, I gave my attorneys a retainer, I think, of $40,000, and they were charging $800 an hour. And you think $40,000, it's a lot of money. They're going to take care of the whole case. You're naive, and I was, and you don't really do the calculus on this. Well, the reality is that's 50 hours of work, and that money is going to be exhausted in about 6 or 7 days. Yeah, but you don't think about that. So after about $100,000 and something, maybe a few months with that first attorney, that first law firm, which was recommended to me, I decided that that was unsustainable because I just didn't have the money. And so I had to switch gears, and I had to find a more inexpensive attorney to help me go through the divorce. I ended up finding another attorney, and she carried the case for the next year and a half. And she was most decidedly not the best attorney, but she was an attorney for representation, because you think, I can't go into court naked.
Mm-hmm.
I have to have representation, and you operate from that position. And I think this, and I hope this conversation will get to the point where I'm able to tell people that they really can do this on their own. But I didn't understand that. I felt that I need the representation, but I needed it to be cheaper. And you go attorney shopping, and everybody says that they have the experience, but at the end of the day, what you end up getting is somebody who will never be as fervent, as emotional, as angry, as determined as you are. But we can talk about that anyway. So when we first get this judge, I guess I'll go ahead and mention his name. His name was Alexander Giza, because I don't have anything negative to say about him, other than I have sympathy for the fact that he didn't understand family law. So he got us at the beginning, and as the evolution of PA manifested, and I would bring him evidence of what was going on, he would chalk it up to, routinely, he would chalk it up to mom and dad not getting along. Like traditionally, mom and dad, come on, you guys got to play in the same sandbox. Go see therapists. And I'd say, Your Honor, it's a bit more diabolical. That's not exactly where we're at here. There's something deeper at play here. Yeah, go see therapists. And it was interesting how that worked, because he would order us to go see therapists. Mom, you pick 3 therapists. Dad, or dad picks 3 therapists, gives them to mom. She makes a selection. And my ex-wife made a show of that. And we ended up having to go back to court repeatedly just so we could get in front of a therapist. But that's a sidebar, because if you talk about your opponent in the case of parental alienation, it's usually going to be a narcissist.
Mm-hmm.
And that term is thrown around all the time. But when you get into a case of parental alienation, you really talk about what the definition of a narcissist is. You begin to understand how brutal an opponent, a narcissist, can be.
Oh,
And
yes.
how manipulative a narcissist can be. And a narcissist is, and especially a parent that's bent on being an alienating parent, can be extremely convincing to all the people that she comes into contact with. So we were ordered into therapy when we finally got there, which was probably a year, no exaggeration, after it was ordered, because of the tap dancing I had to go through with my ex-wife to get her to concede to picking out a therapist, where it was located, even the nationality of the therapist my ex-wife had to have her choice in. We finally get to therapy, and this is literally what happens. The first therapist we went to see, We go into this therapist's office. My ex-wife and my daughter show up, and literally within 20 minutes, the therapist is like, holy hell, the children are being abused by mom.
Mhm.
And then she talks to my ex-wife. That was the last time we ever saw that therapist. My ex-wife was never going to go back to that therapist again. So we
Mm-mm.
go back to
Mm-mm.
court. And you think, okay, well, now my ex-wife is violating orders. Certainly there are going to be reparations for violation of orders to go to therapy. She unilaterally just decided she didn't want to go to the therapist because the therapist said to her, hey, you're abusing the children. You know, they're getting what they're getting from you, not from him. And another good point this has roots and this has digression layers. Another good point to digress upon, and I sent you the law enforcement video. Law enforcement got involved in my particular case 2 or 3 times, and I was able to get the body camera footage each of those times. And law enforcement, as it pertains to therapists and clinicians, are kind of interesting because my heart goes out to law enforcement officials. They haven't been to school for 4, 5, 6 years. They don't have a master's in family law or family administration or family therapy, but
Mhm.
they are the best at diagnosing it, seeing it on the spot, seeing it go down, diagnosing it, but they are powerless. You know, they are helpless. You know, no amount of whatever they put in a police report is going to be considered by a court because the court doesn't recognize them as clinicians. And the police, for their for you know to their credit, they're not afraid to write what they're observing in a report. And if you watch some of the videos that I showed you
Mhm.
on the interference that I experienced during custodial visitation, they would tell mom, hey, you're interfering. You got to knock this off. You can't do this. He's got a visitation order. He's got to see his children. And then you'd bring that up in court with police orders, with body camera footage that mom's interfering with custody. And in the case of us, there was mom for 3 years ran roughshod on our Judge Giza, and the court. She was never reprimanded for anything that she did. That came later. We'll get to that. But for 3 years, the family law system enabled her. And more specifically, Judge Giza enabled her, not because he was a bad judge, but just because he didn't want to make a strong decision or put teeth into his orders.
Mhm.
He wasn't familiar with it. And so, since he didn't understand parental alienation, um, he would continually chalk it up to, hey, go back to therapist, go back to therapist, go back to therapist. We went and had, I don't know, 5 or 6 therapists over 3 years. All of them said the same thing. Actually, another good point to talk about: therapists.
Mhm.
There's so many that are good, but at least in the case of California, every single one of them is afraid to be the opponent of a narcissistic parent in a parental alienation circumstance because, God forbid, they put into a report mom's abusing the children. And by the way, in a case of alienation, it's 50-50. It's not always wives doing it to ex-husbands or ex-husbands doing it to wives. It's right down the middle. So it's not a male or a female thing. It happens pretty equally. But getting back to therapists, God forbid they should put, in this case, mom's abusing the children. They're afraid of mom because mom's going to come after their license. And how dare they make that kind of diagnosis and try to take her children away from her. And then suddenly they're battling to keep their practice and their livelihood.
Mhm.
So that's in a nutshell, that's the state of clinicians in the state of California and the family law system in California. It's you can't even imagine how it is. I would continually go into court and I'd say, Your Honor, here's a report from the therapist, which, by the way, was completely watered down, because although they might have felt like there was abuse, they would never put that in there. So you'd have to kind of get the judge to hopefully read what was going on, what was in plain sight, to which he would ignore, because there would be no recommendations of custody or anything else like that by the clinicians, because God forbid they do that.
Mhm.
God forbid they see a child being abused and actually do something about it, even though they're a mandated reporter. By the way, mandated reporter, total joke.
Right.
You know, they all were mandated reporters, but if they're actually doing what they're supposed to be doing, my children wouldn't have been psychologically traumatized for 4 years. I would have had custody of them a long time. So we'd go to
Mhm.
court and I'd say, Your Honor, here's the report from the therapist, which, by the way, we're no longer seeing because she's refusing your orders to actually go to that therapist. Mom Come on, mom, you
Mhm.
got to go to therapy. Oh, and by the way, Your Honor, in addition to refusing your orders, my eldest daughter sent me an email saying she wants me to slit my throat and die. So
Mm.
what's going on here isn't the garden variety mom and dad getting along, because we wouldn't go to court and there wouldn't be allegations of, oh, he's abusing the children, Your Honor, he's hitting the children, he's an alcoholic. That didn't exist. What was happening in the background was my children are being weaponized against me in a divorce and being, in a way, subliminally taught to hate dad and everything associated with dad. You watch the law enforcement videos that I sent you, and my children would be going on and on about how scared they were of dad. Well, why are you afraid of dad? Oh, because he cheated on my mom. That's not what I asked you. Why are you afraid of him? Uh, he doesn't give my mom a lot of money. I'm understand what I'm asking you, young lady. Why are you told me you're afraid of your dad. Does he hit you? Well, he kicked us out of our house. We no longer live in the same house we grew up in. Okay, you kids are full of a lot of information you should not have.
Right.
So in those cases, they would go to mom, also on camera, and say, "Hey, mom, get your act together. Stop feeding these kids. Stop conditioning these kids. Dad has a custody order. They're going with dad." Now,
Mhm.
law enforcement saw right through it. Clinicians saw right through it, but nobody was going to do what was necessary to help me in court, which
Mhm.
also makes my next point really salient. If you're a parent and you're experiencing parental alienation, here's what you'll hear after repeatedly losing: just give up. Just give up. They'll come around. The kids will come around. They'll
When
come.
they're
So
18.
and so. Yeah. Well, interestingly enough, and I would ask everybody who gave me this advice, I'd say, oh, well, when will they come around? Give them 5 or 10 years. And I'd think to myself, has this person lost their goddamn mind? I don't know if I'm going to be alive in 6 months. I'm not going to throw in the towel on my children. What could be more important than a fight to regain a loving relationship with your child? What can be more important than that? And that's a rhetorical question, because the answer is nothing. But everybody gave me that advice. Just give up. Just give up. And I got to tell you, sometimes that advice sounded really good, because after 3 years of going like 0 in wins and like 40 in losses in court, you reach some dark places. The Stanley Moss Courthouse in Los Angeles is this big mausoleum
Mhm.
built in, I think, the 50s. And it's just this big marble and brick, massive building with 10 floors, 11 floors, with hallways that are about a quarter-mile long. And I could remember in so many cases leaving court after, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, after showing the judge, here's video of my children telling me to kill myself. Here's emails and text messages of them telling me to burn in hell and die,
Mm.
and having no opposition from mom. You know, Mom's not necessarily fighting that. She's just being quiet, and I lose. It's not like there was anything to weigh this out, but the judge just saw that his mom and dad not getting along, and that's why there was entropy. But my point is, I'd lose.
Mhm.
Mom would go home. She'd have custody of the children. My visitation with them would be ignored. And the visitation was an interesting thing, because we just never had normal visitation. But getting back to my point, I'd lose. I'd go out into the courthouse. There might be people at 2 o'clock, and I'd sit there on the bench, and I reached some of the lowest moments in my life. I remember sitting on those marble benches, and time would fly. And then I'd look up, and it's 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, and court security is asking you to leave, and you're in a long vacant hallway, and there's nobody there. And all you're thinking about is, how do I go on tomorrow? How do I get myself through this? Because, to get in front of a judge, I love how everybody makes it seem so easy. You need to go see the judge. You need to go.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, file orders to go into court. You're not going to see a judge for 90 days, 120 days.
Mhm.
Meanwhile, if you're in a case of alienation, 120 days is like 7,000 years.
Mhm.
There's so much time in 120 days for an alienating parent who's targeting you to continue weaponizing the children. My visitation de-evolved to the point where at first it was The children didn't want to get out of the car. I'm sorry, there's nothing I could do. They don't want to go with you today. And if law enforcement would show up, they were all sympathetic, but they couldn't physically pull the children out of the car. And that would be the end of it. And of course, law enforcement would say, hey, go tell the court that she's playing games. That's what I would be armed with. But I wouldn't see my children. So I'd leave dejectedly, not seeing my children again, knowing they didn't want to see me. And by the way, I was opining to be with children who hated me, who wanted me dead. But I was showing up repeatedly because I wasn't going to disavow my responsibility as a father, and I wasn't going to disavow my what I felt internal ethical compass, which said, you know, these children are everything, and you need to do everything you can. Finally, my visitation, instead of having the children together, I quickly realized that that was a dysfunctional group dynamic, because when I would get them, it would be the equivalent of here's how I could paint that picture. If I ever got all three of them in the car, it would be analogous to you saying, Marianne, in the next room, there's a rabid hyena, weighs 400 pounds. It could crush your bones with its teeth. I want you to go in there and I want you to hug the hyena. That's what it was like when I would have all three of the children in the car, when we'd have law enforcement that would, you know, be good enough, talented enough to get them out of the car into dad's car. The harassment would be, they'd be kicking me from the back seat. They'd be screaming at me. They'd be calling me names. And that was how 8 hours went. I would be opining to have that time with my children. And I know that to some people listening, they think, what's that like? There aren't adjectives to describe what the visitations were like when I had them, but I had them. You know, were they seeing me? Yeah, they were seeing me, but you can't even catalog what a visitation was like when they're all together. And so I began to think to myself, this is terrible. Me taking the children in this state is further traumatizing them, because at that point they were all, you know, they were all against me. They were all aligned to hate me. They would, you know, they would call my now current wife, at the time my fiance, they would call her a whore, slut. When they would be in her presence, they would say the most insane things. They would make her feel terrible. I was just a terrible thing. So after a while, I decided, you know what, this isn't good to have them all together. I'm going to try to see them one by one. That turned into a debacle. Those visits went as follows. I would meet my ex-wife at a point between our two homes, which is about 50 miles. It was a Starbucks, I believe in Altadena, California. And I would be waiting there. Mom would pull up. The child who I designated for that visit would run out of the car with a backpack with an iPad, extra batteries, money, and run into Starbucks. Mom would leave. And so I would go into Starbucks to follow my child, who would sit down at a table. I would approach, and then suddenly it was, get away from me, creep. What are you doing? Get away from me. Who are you? Blah, 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 and create a ruckus in the middle of Starbucks. Early on, I explained to the people at that particular Starbucks, hey, here's what's going on. I'm really sorry. And they, you know, they're sympathetic, but they have a business to run. So my one-on-one visits de-evolved to where I would sit on the steps in front of the Starbucks, sometimes 100 degrees, 110 degrees in the summer, just to make sure nobody didn't kidnap my child who was inside, who didn't want to come out with me. 5 o'clock would come around, mom would show up, child would run out, and that would be the end of my visitation. You know, and you think to yourself, well, that's crazy. Didn't you tell the judge? Well, don't even get us back to that, because you bring that to court, and yeah, you got visitation. You got visit. Did you see your child? Well, yeah, but this is how they're behaving and acting. You know, you're afraid the police are going to get called every single time you want to see your children. What's that like? So this went on in perpetuity for a few years. And as I said, I was winless. And throughout this time, my children de-evolved into just everything that you could think a child can't de-evolve to. And when your child who used to tell you how much they loved you and couldn't wait to see you until you got home and ask you when you were going to take them on a daddy-daughter date would suddenly tell you that they want you to, you know, want you to slit your throat and end it. You know, I hope you burn in hell. I want you to die. I'm forgetting a lot, but I passed along the audio and video file to you that maybe you've had a chance to look through. It's as bad as you could possibly imagine. I ended up going to the California appeals court over the family court's decision. I lost there. Eventually, the family court has a presiding judicial official, and he's sort of like air traffic control. And he said, okay, this has been kicking around in court now for 4 years. It was 4 years at that point. So in the case of Marino versus Marino, in this case, you're going to go to a trial court judge. You're going to have all the matters decided. We're going to, everything that's outstanding that you guys can't see eye to eye on, you're going to a trial court. Now, around this time, I had my third attorney, and that was right about the point where I lost my third attorney. I'm going to mention him because he's an amazing person. His name was Robert Sainburg, and he was by far the best attorney that I had. I had him too late when I had no financial resources, so inevitably I couldn't carry him through, which actually turned out to be a blessing. Mm-hmm. Robert, to his credit, understood parental alienation, understood that it was a dark art and that it was a specialized portion of child abuse, and gave me a lot of the insight that I needed. And then to back us up further, I didn't know what was going on until I stumbled across a video by the late Dr. Stephen Miller. Stephen Miller passed away about 1.5 years ago, and I'd say he was a giant in the field of parental alienation, and he was selfless in the way he was vociferous for the rights of whoever he was advocating for. I found a video, it's still on YouTube, and I'm going to send you the link, and I hope I need for you to disseminate this to your listeners. I watched this video, Marianne, of Dr. Stephen Miller, and he was in Connecticut, I believe, and he was talking for about 7 to 10 minutes in the video, and it was like a spiritual epiphany. I didn't really know what parental alienation was until Dr. Stephen Miller spoke for about 7 to 10 minutes on the topic, and I believe it was a city council meeting or was some kind of meeting, and I don't remember but I remember watching this, and it was an awakening. I'm like, oh, that's exactly what I'm experiencing. It's called parental alienation. Holy hell, it has a name, it has a title, it's recognized. I got to tell you, for anybody who doesn't understand what parental alienation is, this 7-minute video, and I would talk to Dr. Miller after that, and he's like, you know, that video? He goes, I did that video. I made that appearance, rushed, hurried. It was an afterthought. That's the video that captivated you. And it's kind of funny because as it turns out, he had so much better content. But that video was for me like a turning point where I'm like, holy hell, this happens. It's cataloged, it's documented, and it's got a name. It's parental alienation. So anyway, I managed. Stephen Miller passed away about 1.5 years ago now, but I was fortunate that I was probably one of the last cases that he testified in. Dr. Miller, towards the end of his career, he didn't testify in cases anymore. It had to be something really visceral, and something that was, you know, really standoutish in its veracity for him to step in. And I was blessed that on one of the days of my 11-day trial, which I'll talk about in a second, I actually had Dr. Stephen Miller. And when he passed away, the understanding and the movement of parental alienation really took a hit. But anyway, so I had Robert Sainburg as an attorney, but I could no longer afford Robert Sainburg, who's an amazing attorney, and he still practices here in Los Angeles. So I lost Robert as an attorney just for the pragmatic reasons of not being able to pay him. He carried me for a very long time, in fairness to him, while I wasn't able to pay him. But eventually my debt to him just grew to the point where he's like, Chris, I can't do it anymore. I've got other cases, and I feel so strongly about yours, and I relate to yours, but I just can't go on. He was very genuine, very authentic about it. I had so much respect for the way he gracefully separated with me. But he was amazing. But he had introduced me to all these concepts. I found Stephen Miller. So now I'm told by the trial court, by the family court in Los Angeles, you're going to trial court. Now, up until that point, I was winless. I lost my relationship with my children going on 4 years. There's a void of 4 years in my life with my children. I'm hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. My children hate me. They let me know every chance they can get. I've completely lost. And we're going to go in front of a trial court judge. And that's going to be my last stand. Literally, it's going to be my last stand. If I lose with the trial court judge, I've lost my relationship with my children. That'll be it. And so with those stakes, I knew trial was coming up. And at that point, I think the trial court date was about 8 to 10 months off. I had about that much notice. And this was in the height of COVID, so everything was backed up. So I had that much notice. And what happened was I approached trial court as my own attorney. And every weekend, I treated it like a dissertation. I would go hole up in a friend of mine who had an office close to my house, and I would hole up there for an entire Saturday or Sunday, 10 to 12 hours a day. The amount of time my current wife sacrificed in these proceedings is a topic all by itself, but she lost me for 10 months while I prepped for this trial. And I treated it like a dissertation, and I became, I hope, a skilled lawyer. I'd have to understand how to handle objections, how to present evidence, understand the civil code of procedure for family law, how to basically prep a witness, how to declare a witness as an expert to the court, how to examine, how to cross-examine. I literally had to learn this. Now, I'm going to stop again, and I'm digressing like I have so many times. I'm going to say something that up until this point might sound really incredulous. I have a really good relationship with my ex-wife at this point. At this time that we're recording this, I have a good relationship with my ex-wife. But up until that point, she was complacent, and with good reason. She won every time we went to court. No matter what I showed up with, no matter how damning my evidence was, no matter what I had from therapists, there was never any repercussions for anything that she ever did. So in very many ways, the family law system set her up to be complacent for trial. And when we went to trial, it was announced we had a female judge, and she was amazing, because for the one reason in my mind, without ever sitting in her courtroom, she had like 16 or 17 years on the family law bench. So it was, to me, it was like, oh my God, there's somebody in the family law system that is actually tenured, that's actually been there longer than 3 years, and who's seen repeated family law cases. So I was like, I thought to myself, that was the first sign to me that I might have a chance. But of course, I was surrounded by people who would say, oh, so it's a female judge, your wife is female, that's not daylight at the end of the tunnel. That's the oncoming car. But here's the thing though, I never lent myself into that. I never let myself, hear that. I always thought that I had a chance no matter what day it was in court, no matter what the odds were, and despite the circumstances. I continue to think to myself throughout these 4 years, it'll change. One of these days it'll change. However, now the stakes are high. I'm in trial court. I'm against my ex-wife who's complacent. I've got I'm just going to name her too, because I don't have anything disparaging to say about any of the judges. Her name is Diana Gould Saltman, a very tenured judge in the family law court in Los Angeles. So we go into her court. I'm in pro per. I'm representing myself, which is also suicidal with all of this at stake. But I didn't have the money for representation. But I quickly realized after 3 years, and I think a lot of other parents will recognize what I'm about to say too, it doesn't matter who your attorney is, because none of them are ever going to argue as strenuously, as vociferously, as passionately as you will. Nobody will ever be able to represent yourself as well as you. And you think, well, how can I do that? I'm not an attorney. You don't have to be. If you've been to court enough, which I was, you begin to understand the processes and procedures, and you begin to understand what it is that needs to be done. And there is support online from plenty of places that can kind of give you the training wheels that you need. And courts are very forgiving, if you misspell things or if you don't procedurally get things totally right because you are in pro per or you're defending yourself. But with the stakes as high as they were, I was out of money. And so I had to represent myself. So I go into court, and Diana Gould Saltman is presiding. We have 11 days trial, and I was very, very prepared. Um, I prepared probably half a terabyte of information, which is an amount that's really difficult for a lot of people to articulate, but it's tens of thousands of pages. And you think, well, how do I compile tens of thousands of pages into 11 days? How do I present all this audio and video evidence? How do I, argue on examination? And how do I, cross witnesses? Well, again, I prepped, and I really treated this like it was everything that was important to me and everything that I had to do for the salvation for the rest of my life, my current wife, and the salvation of my children.
Mm-hmm.
So we go into court, and after 11 days, and I'm really cutting to the end, but each of these 11 days, something happened. And it's interesting, if you're in court, and even if you're not your own attorney, you generally have a litmus or a feel for how you did that day while you're waiting for orders. Like, how do we do? You go into the hallway. Everybody goes into the hallway during court, and you're like, oh, how'd we do? How'd we do? And you generally have a feeling, for how you did. Well, I recall the judge asking me if I wanted to put my wife on the stand. I did not, because I knew exactly what that would turn into, for lack of a more articulate description, a shit show.
Right.
My ex-wife put me on the stand, which ended up being a tactical mistake for her. I had some therapists testify on my behalf, and that's a complete chapter, because we had these therapists that finally testified for me. There was 3 of them that we were ordered to see together. It didn't take long into therapy with those 3 therapists, who I believe we spent about $50,000 over 5 months, for my ex-wife to peace out, to eject. Once she saw the writing on the wall, and that it wasn't that the therapists were seeing that she was stonewalling and not cooperating with the process, they kind of told her how things were and what they were observing. She pieced out. She violated another order for therapy, but I managed to get these therapists to testify for me. And if you think I'm about to say something good about them, that's where you're wrong. This was a joke, because on the day of, they have an attorney who immediately tries to block their appearance. Thankfully, the judge wasn't having that, and I was able to convince their attorney to get them to speak. But it was kind of farcical, because when I finally was able to examine them on the record, they said nothing helpful to me, because their attorney would object to every single question I asked. Like, literally, even though I knew what they knew, I couldn't get at it, because their attorney was keeping them from liable exposure, because they were so afraid of mom. The one question I was able to ask them that really swung in my favor that day, I asked them, I said, did one of the parties threaten you? Well, the attorney didn't object to that, which was kind of odd. But the response was, yeah. And I said, hey, was I one of the parties that threatened you? And the answer was no. So suddenly the tone changed that day, of on a day when it could have gone really badly for me. The judge is able to say, oh, okay, hold on a sec here. Their attorney is not letting them answer about anything he's asking, but he was just able to get them to concede that one of the parties had been threatening them. So the judge was able to kind of read the tea leaves and see where that was going and what the unspoken language was there. And there was plenty of unspoken language, but there was plenty of stuff that I presented over 11 days. But my point is, each day you think to yourself, how did I do today? How did I do today? And I remember thinking to myself over those 11 days, I won. You never truly know, because I thought I had won for the previous 4 years, only to have myself repeatedly lose. Well, as it happens, the judge didn't make a ruling after those 11 days. She was going to give us a couple of more months before she came back to her decision. And I thought, oh, a couple of months.
Oh,
I go,
no.
Then I thought to myself, well, I was trying to present exigence, which was, in this particular case, a crisis of psychology with my children, and how urgent it was But if she was telling me it's going to take another 2 months for me to give you a decision, my thought to myself was, I lost. As good as I thought I did, if she thought it was how I painted it, and she took the evidence as I displayed it, because everything I gave the court was damning in its ability to sway anybody who had a conscience. Like when I would show the videos, and I think I showed you videos of when my children had a good relationship with me, how adoring they were, how affectionate they were, the emails and text messages they used to send me. And then suddenly you have law enforcement video of them going crazy on me. You had text messages where they were telling me to kill myself. And the thing is, the treatment of my children to me got so bad over 4 years because the court never reined it in. So in the same way the courts made my ex-wife more complacent, she just translated that to, I can do anything I want and let the children get out of hand as they want, as I want to let them, because I'm winning. Well, anyway, so flash forward, I'm now, I take this as a harbinger. I'm going to lose again. So we go to court. I believe it was June 19th of 2021. We go to court that day, and the bailiff comes out to my ex-wife and I and says, okay, the judge is prepared to issue orders in this case. There can't be any outbursts. And when the bailiff said that, I thought, well, why? I wasn't prone to outbursts. I never had been. Why would so I was trying to read into the body language of the bailiff, because, the bailiffs usually know. The court staff probably knows how things are going to go down before you do. So that was the first moment to me, after thinking that I was going to lose. That was the first moment that I thought, oh, why would there be outbursts? Would there possibly be an outburst because my ex-wife might, be emotionally unhinged if she loses custody of her children? But I didn't want to allow myself to go there, because it's a place I'd never been. And all along, all I had ever been asking for, and this is such an important point because it's important for PA parents to understand this, a targeted parent, your goal, your absolute goal, is to get sole custody of the child so that the child can have their bonds with you reestablished, and not until that time should they have involvement with the parent who is alienating them against you. So that was my goal. My goal was to get sole custody. Now, look, your listeners will understand this. You'll understand this. Custody, no matter what state you're in, is never, ever reversed, but with the exception of proven physical abuse, sexual abuse, involvement of law enforcement, incarceration, drug use. It has to take something really extreme to flip-flop custody. And all along I'd hear from people, oh, dads never get custody. You're a guy, you're never going to get custody. So you have all this stacked against you. I'm asking for a trial court to recognize the existence of parental alienation, which was not a very common concept to any family court, let alone a trial court in Los Angeles. So I'm asking them to understand and recognize parental alienation as a justified abuse science. And I'm asking them to switch custody, to give me custody. And on top of that, I'm asking to have a no contact order issued against the children's mother for such a time that I can work to reunify myself with my children and regain that bond. I was also asking for orders to go to Turning Points for Families, which is a program run by Linda Gottlieb in New York. And I want to talk about that momentarily. But to get on with the rest of the break, I was asking for all this stuff. There's less than a 1% chance I'm going to win. There just is. I'd never won. I'm asking for everything that I would never get unless there was some extreme circumstances of abuse, the garden variety stuff, physical, sexual, and none of that existed. There weren't any allegations of it. Lo and behold, the judge put forward a 49-page set of orders granting me sole physical and sole legal custody of my 3 children, issuing a no contact order against their mom.
Mm, mm.
Sorry.
That's okay. Oh my goodness.
And it was like I remember sitting there reading it, and I remember thinking to myself, I can't believe I'm reading this.
Mm.
I can't believe it. You know,
Yeah.
and it gave me everything that I had asked for, and pretty passionately with prejudice.
Mm.
Um, if you read the orders. So anyway, I get custody of my children, and you think that's where the story ends. Well, that's actually where, for an alienated parent, that's where the problems actually really begin, because
Mhm.
it's be careful what you wish for. The very
Mhm.
next day, a sheriff's department in the city of where the children were residing was the location where I had to take custody of my children, and I took custody of them the very next day. By the way, they hate me, can't stand me, and now they're being forcibly ripped away from their mom
Mhm.
for reasons that to them are inane. They can't understand it. There's no plausible explanation. I'm such a demon, mom's such an angel. Why would anybody be taking them away from mom? So I get them the very next night. My poor current wife gave so much in this process, but suddenly all three children are living with us. And this is 2021. We get on a plane, red eye, and we fly to New York to meet with Linda Gottlieb for Turning Points. Now, I want to talk about Turning Points for just a second, because a lot of alienated parents will say, well, what's the end game on this? Well, I told you what the end game is. You want sole custody, you want a no contact order. But then what do you do about the children?
Mhm. Mhm.
There's turning points for families, and there's other reunification programs. And I want to make sure that everybody understands this. These programs are imperative,
Mhm.
but nobody should ever go into any of these programs, whether it's turning points or any kind of reunification week, class, or meeting, with the expectation that you'll go from a de-evolved relationship with your children to wherever it had been. That just does not happen.
Mhm.
Okay. Turning points is necessary in the same way that an intervention is necessary with an alcoholic or a drug user, where family and friends convene on this person to try to change the circumstances. That is exactly what Turning Points is amazing at.
Mhm.
And that's exactly what it's for. And, and to be sure, it's a very visceral experience for the children. There's nothing positive about an intervention if you're the focus of the intervention.
Mhm.
And in the case of Turning Points, there's nothing positive for the children who are having to go through intervention or Turning Points, because who is this person and what are they talking about? They don't know my dad and how amazingly terrible he is. And
Mhm.
but it's good at in the intervention sense is it plants a seed. After a week in New York with Linda, the seed was planted that, hey, maybe, just maybe, dad's not a bad guy. And there's a takeaway on Turning Points which has stuck to me to this very day, that Linda told my children. God bless Linda, but she told my children this, and it really left an indelible mark. She said, look, even young girls who have been raped by a father still want that father to be in their life. And that floored me
Mhm.
and blew me away. I just couldn't even, it was like an evisceration of the mind. I couldn't even imagine how that could be the case. So what she was telling these children is, look, your dad's not that.
Mhm.
You can't possibly, he since he's never done anything like that to you, and as horrible as something like that would be to fathom, and since that's factually the case, perhaps your dad isn't who you think he is, and perhaps you're going to want him in your life. And Linda was careful to say, look, you guys are so lucky. You have two parents who love you very much. Now, Linda's didn't get into the pathology of what love is from a parent who is alienating children and what love is from a parent who is being targeted. That's not what Linda did, but she told them, to her credit, look, you're lucky. You have two parents that love you very, very much. So as much as an intervention as her program was, and as jarring as it was because it's an intervention, it's necessary in programs like I'm an evangelizer for programs like Linda, because they plant the seed.
Mhm.
They can't possibly reverse 4 years of depravity. They can't possibly erase 4 years of psychological conditioning. Stockholm syndrome, for as another definition. That's not what these programs are for, but they're necessary. Now, the next necessary component to reconstitute an alienated child from a parent is to have good therapy. Now, I know earlier I railed on therapists because of how afraid of their own shadow they are. There's
Mhm.
some dedicated therapists out there, and I didn't find them until I found Bita Tebyani. Bita Tebyani is a therapist here in Los Angeles, um, and she understood the tenets of parental alienation. She had the opportunity to read our case, understand it, communicated with Linda, actually communicated with Dr. Stephen Miller, and took our case. And the children, up until that point, had been conditioned to hate every therapist, because every therapist was just going to side with dad. Every therapist was bad. And that's why they never went to any kind of consistent therapy, because as soon as the therapist saw the writing on the wall, mom would yank them, and they'd never have a relationship with that therapist, and it would just be a bad therapy experience. Bita was amazing. It took Bita 4 or 5 months, but they went from completely untrusting of her to completely malleable and open to the concept of thought and trust. She gained their trust, and there aren't many Bita Tebyanis out there. There aren't many Linda Gottliebs out there. There aren't many Robert Sainburgs out there, and these are some of the characters that I was blessed that helped in so many ways to get me to the point where I'm at today. Now, I've recovered nearly 100% of the relationship with my oldest daughter. I've recovered 95% with her sister, my second oldest daughter. I've recovered about 75% of my relationship with my youngest daughter, with my first wife. And we all get along, and we all play in the same sandbox. And I have two wonderful children with my current wife. And my daughters, when they first came to live with us, were never going to call my two new children their sisters. Those aren't my sisters. Don't talk. That's my sister. We'll never call. They've gone from a place like that to where everybody plays and everybody gets along and hugs are exchanged and they play with each other. And it's just this miracle of mine.
Yeah, it is.
It's a miracle to see my children, whom I love all, to see them finally coexisting with each other and in the same house. And look, I said what sounds like a lot of disparaging things about my ex-wife, but here we are today. It took a loss of custody of my ex-wife. It took a no contact order for us to get to this place, but it's possible. It's not likely that these situations end like this, but I have a good relationship with her today. Um, I can have an entirely different podcast on the amount of times that she violated a court order and nothing, and there were no repercussions. But we've surmounted all of that, and I communicate with my ex-wife to this day, and she allows me to see the children. We share custody. There's no incidents anymore.
Mhm.
We're all on the same page, which is not normally how these things end.
Mhm.
Um, but it's really, really possible that that they can. I guess to sum up all of this, and I'm sure you'll have some questions. Um, PA exists and it's real.
Mhm.
Nowadays, you have so many people referring to PA as junk or pseudoscience. Well, look, anybody who refers to parental alienation as a junk or pseudoscience is either somebody who has abused a child themselves, somebody who is advocating for an abuser, um, somebody who has a spouse or loved one, and they want to defend that person, knowing full well that person's engaged in a practice of abuse. So anytime you hear that it's a junk or pseudoscience, that person has never been a targeted parent. And then I always question when I see somebody who's making a claim that alienation is a junk or pseudoscience. I question that person. I really think how depraved a person that must be and what their motives might be to. That's like, it's really akin to saying, um, all rapers, all people, all men who rape women, or all women who might rape a man, all rapers are justified. It's the same thing. It's no different. It's like trying to make the most illogical thing seem acceptable or allowable. When you say that alienation is a junk or pseudoscience, you're essentially saying that rape is acceptable, whether it's by a male or a female, because rape is never justifiable. And the minds of these children are being raped by one parent or the other. Now, look, the reason why PA has some bad publicity is because it's easy for a person to weaponize parental alienation when they're the wrongdoer. If they're abusing a spouse, if you're abusing a spouse, you're physically abusing a spouse, your justification might be, well, she's alienating the children against me, Your Honor. You know, that's parental alienation is suddenly being used as a dark art or a dark science by perpetrators of abuse themselves. So I've been hearing this lately, and I've been hearing it lately brought up by the Kazanoff case, Catherine Kazanoff, and what's going on with well, as it may be, she might be deceased at this point, and the very largely publicized case between her and her husband. I've heard some people come out and talk about alienation in the context of that case. To be sure, parental alienation wasn't going on in the Kazanoff case, and it's really, really important to point that out. These girls, as I watched in that video, they don't want to be with dad. They do not like dad. They want to be with mom, but they are with dad. They've been forced to be with dad. They've been court ordered to be with dad. The Kazanoff case is not a case of parental alienation, but the topic of alienation has come up recently because of the Kazanoff case, and consequently, because of the specter of alienation, you start having people, talking about the lack of science behind parental alienation, when in fact there's plenty of science behind parental alienation. By the way, Canada, Europe, and many other countries, Australia, you wouldn't dare be involved in the alienation of a child from a parent. You wouldn't dare target a parent in another country psychologically and try to eviscerate the bonds between a loving child and the parent. That does not fly in those countries. It's recognized, parental alienation is, and it just does. Does it happen? Yes, of course. But the consequences are severe in all countries except the United States. For whatever reason, it's not mainstream here, hasn't been adopted here, and it's misaligned and misused in abuse cases by the perpetrators of abuse themselves. So in those cases, parental alienation has suffered in its authenticity simply because it's been weaponized by the wrong party. But I got to tell you, if you're an alienated parent like I was, it's real. It's lasting. It's lasting. And then the very last thought I'll have on this is I read, and I think it was Warshak, or in a book written by Ashish Joshi. I remember reading the foreword, or somewhere in the beginning of the book, they said parental alienation is worse, and this is another one of those things that blew me away, is worse than the death of a child. Because with the death of a child, there's closure. And in the case of parental alienation, where it goes on for a long period, your child is not dead, but they're dead to you. And there's no closure there. So when you're an alienated parent, there's no closure. You can't reconcile the situation. And in many cases in the United States, the law doesn't necessarily understand or recognize parental alienation because it's not mainstream.
Yeah. How long was your no contact order?
That was a good. It was a good question. It was 90 days, and it became, I believe, it became 120 days. And and here's an interesting thing. It went from Diana Gould Saltman's court back to the previous judge that we had, Alexander Giza. It was kicked back to our home court judge after the trial court ruled on it. And so in many ways, what happened with the trial court was a mandate on Judge Giza, who we had been with for 3 years. He's on floor 3. Judge Gould Saltman is on floor 7.
Mhm.
So we have a 3-year judge and a 17-year judge who now has a 49-page set of orders.
Oh,
Possibly against her orders.
uh-huh.
Okay, because what he's now reading is a mandate on what he did not do for those 3 years. So it gets kicked back to his courtroom with the no contact order. And this is a lot of your listeners are going to find this very easy to believe, but you might find what I'm about to tell you very shocking. We have a court date, maybe 90 days in, and the no contact order still exists, by which mom is still violating that. Mom is still communicating with the children.
Mm.
Not to a point where I can identify it or I have proof of it, but not that that would matter in his courtroom either, because when did a violation of a court order ever matter to him? He issued many orders that she violated and it never mattered. Let me tell you about something really shocking. On this particular day that we're supposed to meet, I believe it was the first time we're supposed to meet back with him since the trial court, I get a Ring camera alert and I catch the camera footage and I see my 3 children running out of the house. My
Mm.
ex-wife had sent, who's not supposed to be communicating with them, had sent them an Uber and was going to Uber them down to the courthouse to speak in her defense. Now, first off, you just think to yourself, that's impossible. How can that happen? She's not supposed to be having contact with the
Oh,
children.
no.
Well, that morning, that my children beat me to the courthouse. They took the Uber there and they beat me to the courthouse. I'm apoplectic. I don't even know how the hell to deal with this.
Oh.
I go in and I meet with Judge Giza. I'm allowed to speak first. And in probably my first show over 3.5 years of audacity, I let him have it. And in so many ways. And I said, Your Honor, I said, you should be incensed. I have an order from the trial court in this building that says the mom is not supposed to have any contact with the children. So I'd like for the court to understand that they're in the hallway and I didn't bring them.
Mm-hmm.
How did my minor children get to the courthouse this morning if their mother is not supposed to be speaking with them? This is a true story.
Yeah, you can't
I
make it
thought,
up.
I thought, okay, this is the point when that Judge Giza, will finally say, holy hell, mom's pushed me too far. I'm going to incarcerate mom. I'm going to do something I've never done because she's blatantly violated the trial court's orders, which, by the way, are a mandate on me. And I'm going to remand her to custody for a day or two. And I'm going to extend the contact order for 6 months. Judge says to her, says, Uh, I don't find you very credible, ma'am, that you don't know how the children got here. Dad, do me a favor, get the kids back in school where they belong. Blah blah blah. I'll see you guys in 30 days. And I'm just like, is this actually happening?
Mhm.
Like this am I it's like you have an out of body experience.
Right.
Like she's violating the no contact order. My minor children are in the hallway. I didn't bring them.
Wow.
And he's saying, come on, you guys. Hey, dad, bring the kids back to school. Mom, you're not very credible, but I'll see you guys in 30 days. So look, the moral of this story is, there's no repercussions for the violation of a court order, in my
Right.
opinion.
Right. I agree.
And I'm not desensitized. I'm speaking from experience.
Mm-hmm.
And is it like this in every judicial system in every state in these United States? No. Are there some other judges who would have just lost their mind when this occurred and incarcerated my ex-wife? For sure.
Mm-hmm.
But that didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
I ended up, my no contact order got extended for maybe another 30 days ish or so. Um, and and through therapy, I was able to get my children to a point where I never not wanted their mom to be in their life. That was the difference between her and I
Mm-hmm.
never, she'll tell you, oh no, of course I want them to. Well, actions are louder than words.
Right.
So what happened was I got my children to a point with Dr. Tebyani, Bita Tebyani, where I thought, okay, I want to help reconstitute them with their mom, because as much as I may not agree with what she's done, um, they need to have both parents in their life.
Mhm.
And then a footnote to all this, and maybe this will add some context. I grew up in foster homes. I
Mm.
don't know who my real father is. I haven't seen my real mom in, I guess, 40 plus years. So I had a very interesting perspective on ensuring that my children had two parents who loved them in their life, as opposed to, look, when I got the orders that I want to do, I had physical, soul, legal. I could have moved to Zimbabwe. I
Mm.
could have moved to Reykjavik, Iceland. I could have did everything that I could to perpetuate the no contact order with the backing of the trial court and therapist, and I could have perpetuated that as as long as I probably needed. But I didn't feel that doing that was the right thing to do, and I felt that I'd gotten them to a point where I could reconstitute them in a healthy relationship with both parents. And I'm really speeding ahead, but now here we are in 2023. I get along with my ex-wife. We co-parent amicably, which you never would have thought would have been possible, but it was only possible because of the loss of custody and the no contact order, compiled with turning points for families and the therapy of Dr. Bita Tebyani and the support of Robert Sainburg. I feel like I'm giving an Academy Award speech where I'm thanking everybody. I'd be remiss if I wasn't thanking my current wife, who sacrificed so much and was so understanding and so amazingly supportive. Without her support and without the support for the children, I wouldn't be in a position where I could allow my ex-wife back into the fold, and for us to be able to do what she and I are doing today, which is we co-parent amicably and we get along, and I see the children whenever I want, she sees the children when she wants, and everything works. And I know that if you're listening to this, you're like, how the hell did that happen?
Yeah, right.
Well, again,
Yeah.
we don't have a podcast. We don't have a podcast long enough for all the details.
Oh, you're
Um,
coming back on.
I appreciate that. I look, in doing this, I wanted to be on this with you because I've watched from afar as you've been an advocate as you had for reform in the family law system, and I thought, look, I didn't have me, and so many other targeted parents didn't have me to at least espouse from a position of experience, and having gone through this in the depravity of the family law system in a city as big as Los Angeles, to have the outcome I did. I need to be able, if I reach, literally, I know this sounds idealistic, but if I give hope to one person through the medium of your podcast, I believe I've done a service, and I'm giving somebody hope, because I was never a person prone to suicide or taking my own life or anything like that, but I can see how easy it would be. And look at the case of Catherine Kazanoff. Allegedly, at this point, she has taken her own life in an assisted suicide because she is without her children. So I
Mhm.
understand what that psychology is like. I understand what that pathology is like. And I wish I had been there for Catherine. I wish, and I hope I'll be able to be there for others if they're in this situation and they're able uh, to, to, to understand that there is hope for a possible good outcome. And it takes many different things to fall into place, but there is a recipe, and there is a book now. And what I mean by book is there's a recipe book that I have put together, at least I hope in my mind, to help people
Mhm.
and maybe navigate this and give them some hope.
Well, definitely. It's just so, you know, shocking with Catherine Kasanoff on October 29th of 2022. She documented everything very well as to how her case was unfolding. And on that day, she said that the ex had alienated her from her own children. And this is what they do when they're a personality disorder.
Yeah, here, but in the let's to be clear, that's exactly what happened, and she's not wrong. But it was the court system that
Right.
alienated her children from her. It wasn't your traditional parental alienation. That the court system in her case, so far as we can tell, conspired against her. And she and to think about this, if your listeners aren't familiar with the story, she's an ex-New York prosecutor. Her husband, her ex-husband, also an attorney with a large law firm. They're both attorneys. They both have equal standing, at least with the understanding of how the law works.
Mm-hmm.
And yet somehow she had loving children to her who still loved her through to the end, who never said anything bad about her, opined to be with her.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no allegations ever that she did anything unsavory to them. Somehow the courts took her children from her and gave them to a narcissist. I can call her husband, Alan Kazanoff, a narcissist.
Mm-hmm.
All you have to do is go watch some of the videos that are floating out there in the ether about him. I mean, some of the, and then if anybody who would detract by that and say, oh, those videos are taken out of context. No, not all 20 of them.
No.
Not all 20 of them. They're not, all 20 of them aren't taken out of context where he's telling her that she's fat, stupid, ugly, lazy, disgusting in front of the children,
Mm-hmm.
screaming at the children, which is in the way he was doing it's absolutely abuse. If you raise your voice, does that make you a bad parent? No. But when you watch Alan Kazanoff do it, you realize that when you raise your voice like he did in the manner he did, in which he did it to his children, he's abusing them.
Mm-hmm. And he sounds like a raving lunatic.
He's off the rocker, and you think to yourself, oh my God, this guy's an attorney. This guy's a partner at a law firm, which, by the way, let's talk about that law firm for 10 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
I hope they dissolve. I hope they lose every last client that they have, because their divorce was going on for 4 years.
Oh.
There's not a single person in that firm who didn't know what was going on in the divorce. They stood by this guy, this senior partner in their firm. They kept him employed. They turned their back on the abuse of these children. And only after this story went mainstream in the last few days did they let him go. And it was so transparent and so dirty in the way that they let him go.
Mm-hmm.
They want to make it seem like, after careful review and after an internal investigation. No. Let's be honest about this. This law firm finally had public scrutiny that it never had before, and they were forced to let somebody go who never should have been employed there. So this law firm, Taurig, and I'm probably, what is the name of the law firm? Do you have it?
I had it.
It's not hard to find it, but the point is, nobody should ever be a client of that law firm again. I hope they dissolve. I hope they lose every last client they had, because they were conspirators in the abuse of children. And nobody in that firm, no matter their level, whether they're answering the phone or they are the managing and senior partner of that firm, has fertile ground to stand on with why it didn't do anything until she has apparently committed suicide and the story has gone mainstream. By the way, I say apparently committed suicide because I want to be fair to the story. It's still so very fresh. She wrote a note saying that she was committing suicide in, I think, Switzerland, in an assisted suicide environment, but I don't know that she's been repatriated to the United States, or her body is. I don't know what her actual. I don't know what her disposition is, and I don't know, that angle hasn't been pursued. So I'm going to assume that that's exactly what happened to her. God save her soul, and God have mercy on those poor children, the lives that they're going to live if they've lost their mom.
That was Greenberg and Trauger.
There we go.
Taurig.
Taurig. Yeah, I hope this podcast reverberates, and every other media broadcast and attention reverberates to the point where anybody doing business with them has a sense of morality and disbands from having them retained as general counsel or as counsel at all, because that law firm is absolutely a partner in the abuse of these children and the inevitable death of these children's mothers. I can't say enough bad about that law firm. There's plenty of attorneys out there who are an amazing, benevolent group of people, but that law firm deserves to descend into chaos and fall apart.
They need to be audited, because were they financing this millions of dollar divorce where he did alienate her from her children? Those kids were calling her by her first name. They weren't even calling her mom anymore.
Yeah,
So
you're okay.
he did
Yeah,
a number on those kids, and that law firm perpetuated and babied him through all this. And how
yeah,
dare they baby that
yeah.
thing was a lawyer?
Yeah. The thing is, I try not to descend into the Oliver Stone conspiracy theories, but I got to say, I, I won't be surprised in this case if 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 orders were bought, if verdicts were bought, just because of the fact that his law firm was as dialed in as they were with local judges. I mean, if there's a case where I would allow myself to go into conspiratorial theory and thought process, this would be it. That was a very well connected law firm that apparently
Mhm.
had probably relations with judges on the bench that presided over his case that should have recused themselves, yet they were allowed to be in a position to adjudicate the matter of this case between Kazanov and Kazanov. That law firm needs to go down in flames. Those judges need to be investigated to the extent that the law will allow in those states. What happened in this case is just it's innate. It's crazy.
Right, it's beyond egregious.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
uh, people beware. You'd like to say, stay out of the family courts, but if you get hauled in there with a personality disorder, you're stuck, and you're stuck defending yourself, trying to get your kids out of this mess.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say you're right. It becomes a depraved, tangled mess. I mean,
Mhm,
already the family law system, no matter what state you're in, is just it's a sad state of affairs. It's unaudited. Um, there's no recourse for the decisions that are made. These judges are always the judge, jury, and executioner. By the way, the trial court that decided in my favor, it wasn't by a jury; it was by a single judge.
mhm,
I believe that juries probably should sit in these proceedings, but if you're getting brought into a family court case over a divorce with somebody who's narcissistic or is bent on destroying you, and they've got resources, speed bump doesn't even begin to describe what lays ahead and how things
mhm.
will end up turning out. It's just really, really bad.
Oh, how do you spell Beta's name? The other
Yeah,
counsel.
Bita is Bita, and Tebyani is Tebyana. And since we're on that subject, Robert Sainburg, Robert Sainburg, family law attorney, practices here in Los Angeles. Between the two of them, and of course Linda Gottlieb for Turning Points for Families, um, I would not be having this conversation with you with the disposition that I have without their help.
Mhm. Well, I'm glad you made it through and you're able to co-parent. It can be done if people would, just let the kids be kids and have both parents. But this is where it gets sticky when someone.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You and I are idealistic when it comes to that. We have I guess we've seen too many Leave It to Beaver and Brady Bunch episodes to think that can go down as smoothly as it does.
Yeah.
Look, there are divorce cases that don't end in acrimony,
Mhm,
but
mhm,
those are usually the exception.
mhm, mhm. Well, even still, you can, like in my case, we divorced amicably, and that was fine for until he married someone, and I wasn't sure if she worked in the courthouse or not when I set them up on a blind date. No good deed goes unpunished, people. And then when I remarried is when all hell broke loose. So,
Yeah, yeah. It Circumstances conspire in a way that you can't even begin to understand or predict, and it's only when you look backwards are you able to connect the dots in time and see how things actually work themselves out. You just don't know. But the reality is most divorces don't go idealistically, um, smoothly. It's the exception to the rule when they do go well. And look, I hate to say this, but it's to the benefit of the attorneys when they don't go well.
mhm,
It's
mhm,
I mean, show me a family law attorney that says, we want to wrap this up in 30 days and get all matters resolved. And I only want to charge you, $2,995, and I'll show you no attorney on the face of the planet. It's just not, even if you had an attorney who wanted to do that, was benevolent enough to want to do that, the complexity of the legal interface for the public is such that it doesn't work like that. You can't, even prenuptial agreements are tested constantly in court. So divorces are just fertile ground for attorneys, fertile ground for clinicians, fertile ground for, definitely fertile ground for conspiracies if you lend yourselves to them about, deals made off the record and through, unannounced or unadvertised relationships between judges and parties in court. I mean, it's system's dirty. People say, what's the solution? If you ask me, hey, Chris, how would you change the family court system? I got to be honest, and I tell you, I have no idea where to start.
Yeah, abolish it.
Yeah, it's can open, worms everywhere. It's just so bad from the bottom to the top to the bottom, beginning and ending with the fact that, judges are judge, jury, and executioner when it comes to the decision. And it's a big problem. I don't have the solution. So you're forced to work in the construct and the confines of the laws that we do have. And you just got to be able to piece your way through it. And hopefully my experience and my story, along with some of the resources that I'll be able to share, will help people navigate their way through it.
I'm so glad I had you on, Chris Marino. How can people reach you if they have any questions?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me there by my name. I'm not hard to find. If you want to give out my email address to anybody who reaches out to you, you could do that. I don't have any kind of advocacy website. I'm just not set up that way. I felt this was an important mission for me to do, to be on your podcast to talk about it. But if there's anybody I can help, I will. And I'll be honest with you. There are just some people who are going to be in this circumstance that no matter what I would be able to tell them is only as important as the perspective it should give them. Because when you're hurting like you are as a targeted parent, nothing takes away that hurt. But I just want to be able to, and hopefully I'll be able to give people at least a perspective of keeping their eyes down the road. If you focus on the now and you focus on the moment, it'll destroy everything around you. You'll lose everything you have. You'll descend into psychological chaos. If you're prone to suicide, you'll take your life, unfortunately, as some have. If you're prone to violence, you'll probably commit it. You gotta have perspective in cases of alienation, because they're marathons, Marianne. They're absolute marathons, and you just got to understand how to pace yourself and how to navigate along the way. But it is possible.
Well, I totally thank you for your insight on all of this. And like I said, I'll have you back on. So if anyone wants to reach Chris Marino, they can contact through me, dismantlingfamilycourtcorruption.com. So Chris, don't jump off. Slam the Gavel is a podcast to help the public understand what really goes on in these family courtrooms. I am your host, Marianne Petrie, author of Dismantling Family Court Corruption, Why Taking the Kids Was Not Enough, and Cry Out for Justice, Poems of Truth. Please join us again here with Chris Marino and other guests. Thank you so very, very much, and have a great Father's Day.